Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Out of the Darkness. I am your host, Q. Um, Glad to have everybody here. We thought we'd do something a little bit different and do a pre-recorded show for you guys. We've had so much popular or positive response from the COVID Hard Truth segment that we did last week that we asked Dr. Williams to come in and to visit with us again and go through some things that some very important information this week. And so we've got a few things we want to go through, and Dr. Williams is gracious enough to be with us. Thank you, sir, for coming in. We don't want to keep you too long, but I think you had about 6 things that you wanted to kind of go through, some things that you've noticed throughout this week with the COVID dynamic. But you doing all right, sir?
I'm doing great, Q. Thanks for asking me to be on.
Well, thank you very much for gracing us with your presence. So we appreciate that. You came on and we didn't scare you off, so that's fantastic.
That's a start.
That's a start. So you had a few things, and I kind of read over a few things, wanted to come on and kind of expound on those, but you had 6 things. I'll let you take the floor and just kind of give us some of those things that you've noticed and some of the things you've kind of looked at this week, and we can discuss a little bit at the end.
Very good. Well, thanks, Q. As you know, I put out another update on my Facebook page today, James Stewart Williams, which folks can read. It's a bit of a long read, and what I said in my column was I had to stop writing this update twice this week because stuff was happening just too fast. A lot of news has come in, so I broke it down into 6 major groups of information. So thing 1, I said, was the early preliminary partially complete data are starting to show us that a lot more people have been exposed to and infected with and become immune to COVID-19 than anyone had previously guessed. First story on that line was the United States Navy announced this week that the USS Theodore Roosevelt, that's the aircraft carrier that was in the news a couple weeks back, out of the 4,000 crew members on that ship, all of whom have been tested, nearly 600 have proven COVID-2 infections, which is 15% of the ship's population. Most significantly, 60% of those infected sailors had little or no symptoms. So that is a huge development. And it, by the way, that echoes very strongly the experience of the people on that cruise ship. The name I've forgotten, but back in January, that cruise ship that had a number of people who died on board. We've only seen, I think, 1 death on the Roosevelt, but 600 people infected, only, and 60% of those, so roughly 400 of those, no symptoms.
Wow.
So that says that we've got, it confirms what a lot of people were saying early on, including what I thought early on, which was that this is going to be similar to influenza in its transmission and its virulence, its ability to cause bad disease. Now, a lot of people with COVID-2 or COVID-19 do not get sick at all, and this is huge. Now, that's not to say that this infection is just like the flu. It's not. Death rates are still reasonably high, and when people get really sick with this, they get really sick. More on that in a little bit. So that's thing 1. Now, thing 2, and did you want me to stop there, Q? Do you want to comment on that first, or just carry on?
Just roll through it. Yeah, just go ahead and roll through it, and we'll save it till the end.
Okay. Thing 2. Now, the first published antibody-proven immunity data have been revealed in California by a group, Santa Clara County, Stanford University group. And these data shocked everybody by finding that the number of people infected in that community was between 50 and 80 times higher than the number of people that the models predicted would be infected. That's a huge number of people infected who were, for the most part, asymptomatic. So again, we're finding out what we had seen on the Roosevelt and in the cruise ship, a lot of people getting infected without symptoms. Now, these data tell us a couple things. First, it tells us that COVID-19 is much more widely spread at this juncture in our history than a lot of people had predicted it would be. And in some ways, that makes sense because we know it's very infectious, and asymptomatic people can spread the infection. So the early models, which most of our social distancing is based on, those models were wrong in many respects, and we're seeing that now. Okay, now for thing three, that doesn't mean we can stop the social distancing practices because they are working. But what we can do is continue to do sensible things to keep from transmitting the illness. So washing our hands, taking our temperatures, keeping 6-foot distances, not doing stupid things. And I think most Americans are already complying with that voluntarily. They don't have to be told. I think most people are doing it out of a sense of civic responsibility as opposed to fear. And I think that's huge. So that brings us to thing four. And thing four is what I'm really excited about, and that is the treatment news. Now, I've said before in my columns and in my previous communications elsewhere that I believe that the vaccine is not what's going to break the back of this pandemic. It's going to be the treatment models that we were able to come up with. In other words, being able to make people better when they're severely ill. And we are seeing some good news on that score. The biggest news this past week was the publication at University of Chicago, I believe it was. It was in Chicago anyway, a study that showed severely ill COVID-19 patients treated with the antiviral drug remdesivir recovered very quickly. There were about 130 patients in the first report, which came out Thursday. And out of those 132, I believe it was, 132 people who were treated, many of whom were very, very sick. The response was almost uniformly very positive. Out of that group, 2 people died in the duration of the study to that point, but 112, I believe it was, 112 have already gone home. So
Wow.
that's a huge recovery rate for these people. And they're not going home to die. They're going home well. They're going home
Sure.
recovering. Now, this trial is an ongoing cohort study, and I mentioned in my column, you need to go back 3 or 4 columns to a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, where I explained levels of evidence in evidence-based medicine. This is what we call a cohort study, which is different. It's a lower level of evidence than a randomized, controlled, double-blind clinical trial, which is
But it wouldn't be anecdotal though.
It's far above anecdotal. There are 7 levels of evidence in the hierarchy in evidence-based medicine. Cohorts trials come in at level 3 or level 4, depending on design parameters. So this is still very good evidence. And we're really excited about this in the emergency medicine community. The only thing that we put out there as a caveat, and I've heard several doctors say this, and I tend to agree with them to some degree, and that is the study has some apparent conflict of interest because it's sponsored and basically administered by Gilead, which is the company that owns the patent to and is the manufacturer of remdesivir. So can you say apparent conflict of interest, boys and girls? I knew you could. Mr. Rogers, he's still alive in my heart. I don't know about y'all. But yeah, it has that smack of conflict of interest, but it's not a huge conflict of interest. And certainly in a time of a pandemic like this, it's not something to get our knickers in a twist over. We're in a war here, and we need to be finding answers fast. So the remdesivir trial is the most positive news that we have seen since the outbreak of this pandemic in the treatment arm of things. Now, on the hydroxychloroquine front, things aren't quite looking as good. There was a major U.S. study, again, a cohort study, that came out showing no real benefit to hydroxychloroquine. But that was testing hydroxychloroquine on its own. Most of the positive stuff that's come out of the study groups in France and Germany, Israel, and China have been looking at hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin or plus zinc or plus the whole 3 together. That seems to be where the most robust recoveries are coming from. But again, this is a cohort study here in America, and these are cohort studies in these other nations as well. So there's a lot of variation in the way these studies are put together, and depending on how you pick your patients, how sick they are, how far along in the disease process they are, you're going to get different results just by who you pick, and many other confounding factors. So we can't just say hydroxychloroquine isn't working, but the first major U.S. study was not positive. The advantages of hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, and zinc is that they're all very readily available medications out in the world, everywhere, relatively cheap. Remdesivir is a new drug. It's only been around since 2015. It's an antiviral drug that was developed to treat the first SARS or SARS-CoV-1, SARS-CoV-1 back in 2015. And although it has been FDA approved, as I understand it, it hasn't been approved for this particular application for this virus, but I doubt that that's going to be a big impediment right now for a lot of good reasons. So again, lots of good news on the treatment front. I won't get into the other thing. I didn't get into it in my column, and I won't do it here because it takes a lot of time. And that is that the intensivists and the emergency docs have learned an awful lot about the management of the people with severe respiratory compromise. So there's a lot of changes in the way we're managing these people.
So, and I know we can't really get into that, but one of the things that I've been hearing a lot is that perhaps the ventilators might not be the best way to deal with some of these COVID situations. Are you guys seeing that also?
Well, I'm not seeing it myself because I've had very few COVID patients that I've actually personally treated. But I'm reading this, or I'm hearing this from my emergency medicine colleagues around the country. I follow a couple of major podcasts that are national, if not international, and everybody is saying, yes, we're trying to keep people from going on to the vents quite as soon. They're allowing what they call permissive hypoxia for people who aren't in severe respiratory distress. And that seems to be making a positive difference for a lot of patients. So
Excellent.
You combine that with the drugs, and we're winning. We're definitely winning this battle right now.
That's exciting to hear.
Yeah. It is very exciting. Now, thing 5, and this is where I start to get a little political, and I try not to get political in these things, and I certainly am not going to say I'm, pro-Republican or pro-Democrat in any way here. This is something that really transcends political affiliation, and that is the FDA and the CDC have really screwed this pandemic up. Really screwed it up. Now, I took my source material from a couple of different articles that summarized it very well, but I went back and checked the dates and so on, and this is absolutely true. The first case of COVID-19 was identified in the United States on January 21st. The first identified case in South Korea was on January 21st. So both South Korea and the United States hit the ground on the same day. Within 1 week, the South Koreans had opened up to every licensed research lab in their country, the option of trying to develop testing kits for this. The United States, however, basically the FDA said no, nobody can do tests except the CDC. So they did not issue licenses to anybody except the CDC, and expressly forbade any non-government labs from developing test kits. Now, that doesn't mean these labs didn't do some work to develop the kits. I think many of them did, otherwise we wouldn't have seen the response we got. So January 21st, by January 28th, there was only one lab in the United States working on a test kit. South Korea, there were multiple labs working on a kit. Now, I'll give you an idea, there's about 250,000 labs qualified to do this kind of work in the United States. 260,000 is the number I've got.
Wow.
And the CDC botched it. Their first test didn't work. They had to go back to the drawing board. And instead of the FDA opening it up at that time, they said, no, CDC, you go back and fix it, develop it again. By the time the President Trump and his pandemic management team finally said enough is enough and forced the FDA to issue other licenses, we were already a month down the road. In fact, by the time we started getting testing out in America in a meaningful way, it was 45 days after the first case. Unconscionable bungling on the part of two federal bureaucracies. Heads should roll. Heads should
Absolutely.
roll.
Absolutely.
And it ticks me off that we have people in Congress saying they want to investigate the president's mismanagement, but they haven't said word one about the bureaucracy that they should be managing and investigating. They haven't said a thing about it. That bothers me. The final thing I said was that the national news media is completely dysfunctional. The news coverage for this thing is atrocious. I said on Wednesday, I picked up a copy of USA Today. 4 sections in that newspaper. There were only 28 news stories in total in the entire newspaper. I counted them. Out of those 28 stories, 19 were about COVID-19. Even in the sports sections, there were 5 stories about COVID-19 as it affects sports and 4 actual sports stories. The amount of information in these stories was terrible. The news media isn't reporting the salient points either in print or on TV, and it's just deplorable. Today's journalists can't math and they don't science. Something has got to be done. We have 6 corporations running the vast majority of news coverage in this country: Disney, Sony, so on and so forth. I'm sorry, I shouldn't even name corporations because I don't know their names off the top of my head. But the fact is, if Theodore Roosevelt was willing to come down on the necks of mining companies with the Antitrust Act back in the early 20th century, somebody needs to do the same thing about these huge conglomerates that monopolize our news today. That's about it. Enough editorializing. The science is looking good. The news coverage is atrocious. That's what I've got to say. Thanks for letting me talk to you.
Hey, I appreciate it. Appreciate you coming on. And, a lot of positives, and we're not hearing enough of that. So thank you for bringing some of the positive stuff. Some of the stuff, as you said, we got to work on some things. There's some things we got to work on as a country, as a government. But we should definitely focus on the positive. We're winning the war, it sounds like, against this COVID-19. But I know it's been a long day for you, and you got a long day tomorrow. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on. And hopefully this won't be the last time. Look forward to seeing you again.
Well, it was my pleasure, Q. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.